Welcome to the final episode on our tour of Fort St. George as part of the special lockdown series. A normal tour of the fort takes as long as 3.5 to 4 hours, and during my heritage tours, I normally take special pains to keep it at 2.5 hours because that's the maximum that people can remain standing on their legs. Today, we are going to go on a whirlwind tour of what is there in the fort apart from what we have seen already. Just to recap, we've looked at the flagstaff, we've looked at the Cornwallis statue and cupola, we've looked at the Assembly and the Secretariat building, and we've looked at the Church of St. Mary's. And now we take a look at the rest of the fort. Let's begin with the Sea Gate. This is one of the 6 gates of the fort, and this was the oldest gate. Today this is completely blocked up, and you need to take special efforts to go and see it. It's just below the flagstaff. This was the gate through which everybody who landed in Madras at one time would have walked into the fort. Behind the Secretariat building, we have this huge expanse of tarred land. This was Parade Square. This is where all the soldiers would have marched round and round every day, twice, in full uniform, no matter how hot the weather. It must have been sheer torture, but it kept the army fighting fit. And let's also not forget that the Indian Army had its birth in Fort St. George. We now come to the St. Thomas's Gate, which is the southernmost gate of the fort. At one time, this was very, very important because it led to the Portuguese town of San Thome. You must remember that when Fort St. George began, it was a bachelor's establishment. And the desperate English needed women, and the women who came were Portuguese women who all came from San Thome. So it was very necessary to have an entrance in that particular direction. So today it points down Kamarajar Sale or South Beach Road and connects eventually to San Thome. On the same road where the San Thome Gate is, and that is called St. Thomas's Street of the fort, you have this house which is in a very, very bad condition. This is known as Last House on Snob's Alley. And what is its historic significance? The fact is that this is one of the oldest surviving structures in the city, probably as old, if not older, than the Church of St. Mary's, which dates it to probably the 1670s. It survived war, it survived cannonballs, it survived cyclones, it survived everything, but it hasn't survived poor maintenance. And today it's supposed to be on its last legs. In sharp contrast is this building, which is known as Great House on Charles Street, which is the headquarters of the Archaeological Survey of India. And this building was once known as Admiralty House as well, though rather erroneously. The fact is that the courts of Admiralty sat here for a very, very brief time. But the historic significance of this house is that Robert Clive, the man who really founded the empire for the East India Company solely on the basis of treachery and corruption, lived here for a couple of years. He had married his best friend's sister, Margaret Maskelyne, in the Church of St. Mary's, and then he had lived in this house for 2 years, and today there is a plaque to that effect on the walls of this building. Next to it, next to the Great House on Charles Street, is this building which is in terrible condition. A part of it has already collapsed, but that hasn't prevented the rest of it from being used as an office. This is where Arthur Wellesley, Colonel Arthur Wellesley, lived in the closing years of the 18th century. Wellesley was the brother of the Viceroy of India, the Governor General of India at that time, the Earl of Mornington, and he had come down here specifically with one purpose: to ensure that a final war is fought with Tipu Sultan and that he is defeated. The war began in 1799 and Tipu Sultan was killed, but Wellesley did not contribute much to it. While the actual battle was going on in Srirangapatna, he and his regiment lost their way in a dense orchard or a grove and actually shot at each other in the darkness because they thought that the other person was the enemy. By the time they came out, the war was over. But what happens when your elder brother is the Governor General of India? You get knighted as a reward for having fought this particular battle. But the next battle that happened with the Marathas in Asai, Sir Arthur Wellesley really did very well. And then he resigned his commission, went back to England, and then in the 19th century, he fought one of the best known wars, the final war, Waterloo, against Napoleon. Eventually, he became the Duke of Wellington and was Prime Minister of England twice. And this was the house in which he lived. A short distance away from that, you have the Grand Arsenal, built entirely on inverted arches, and the building where the East India Company and later the Indian Army stored all its arms and ammunition. And then you have the next important gate, Walaja's Gate, named after the Nawab of Arcot in the 18th century, Muhammad Ali Walaja. This gate actually leads you to Mount Road. It was very important, you must remember, for a direct access to be there for Mount Road. And why was that? Because the army was stationed in St. Thomas's Mount, and they had to move in quickly if there was trouble in the fort, which is why this particular gate was needed. And yet another unique feature of this gate, it was always one way. You could come in, but you couldn't go out. Because if the army had to march in a hurry, you couldn't have vehicles blocking the entrance from the opposite direction. So it is still a one way. All the gates in the fort are exceedingly thick, and they are actually double gates. There's an inner gate and there is an outer gate. So you can imagine that the enemy could not very easily penetrate this fort. The irony is that by the time the fort was completed in the 1790s, no war was ever fought in Madras. And this fort has seen no action ever since. But there is yet another feature of the fort that was tested twice during war and failed miserably on both counts, and that is the moat. Watered at one time by the Kuam River, the Elambor River and the Buckingham Canal, its level was never sufficient to prevent the enemy. The French managed to come in very easily. Hyder Ali could have come in very easily, which he chose not to do. The British soldiers appear to have used it more for fishing. It was hardly a security feature. But till the 1940s, it was in pristine condition, and the water was of excellent quality. Today, it is nothing but a gutter, mostly filled with moss and a lot of sediment. Why was the moat really required to be filled with water? The British lined the walls of the fort with gunpowder so that it could be exploded at a moment's notice. And during the heat of summer, it was necessary for water to be circulating on all sides to prevent the gunpowder from exploding by itself. We have St. George's Gate, which leads you to Poonamali High Road, which is the next important road of the city. And finally, you have North Gate, which leads you to Georgetown. Apart from this, you have certain other interesting features in the fort. You have the King's Barrack, in terrible condition today, but the largest barracks in the entire country. 100,000 square feet of space for soldiers to be stationed in. Then finally, we have the Fort Museum. The Fort Museum was established in 1948 by Lieutenant Colonel D.M. Reed, who was one of the directors of a company called Beardsell in Madras. Just before he left, he proposed that a museum should be set up for storing all the aspects of the British Raj, the relics of the British Raj. And that is how he funded the museum himself. And today, the Exchange Museum. And why is it known as the Exchange? This is where all the commodities were traded and transacted by the merchants of the East India Company till 1799. And that is why it is known as the Exchange Building. And this is where the museum was set up. It is worth a visit. Next time you go to the fort, no matter whether you see anything else or not, you must ensure that you visit the Church of St. Mary's and you see the Exchange Museum. Before I let you go, I must fulfill a promise. I had said that I will tell you the story of the great romance of the fort, and that happened in the shadow of the Church of St. Mary's. Warren Hastings was the agent in charge of the fort, and he was desperately in love with Anna Maria Chappuset, whom he had met on board the ship that brought him to Madras. She was already married, and her husband Baron Imhoff came along with her. He was a lousy artist who thought that he could come here and paint portraits of the Nawabs and other nobility and make a fortune. But even they found out that he was a very bad artist indeed, and he hardly got any business. In the process, he appears to have lost his wife. Hastings was the picture of propriety. Though the whole of Madras knew what he was doing, he advised the Baron Imhoff to go back to England and file for divorce. The divorce was given 3 years later, by which time Hastings had already moved to Calcutta as Governor General. Anna Maria came with him to Calcutta, but they didn't live in the same house. He built her a special house in Belvedere in Calcutta where he kept her. I'm sorry, pun fully intended. And once the divorce was given, he married her there. He was by then Governor General, so nobody could raise an eyebrow and nobody could make a comment. Hastings and Anna Maria lived happily ever after. Thank you very much for having been part of this Fort St. George series. I will be back with you with plenty more on the history of Chennai and on the history of Carnatic music shortly with a lot more episodes. Do send me feedback on what you thought of this series. Bye-bye for now.